Hit that spillway harder. Break it before he can stop us.
Bryn Caldwell screamed at the demolition crew, jabbing one French-tipped fingernail at the concrete control house my grandfather had poured by hand for the WPA in 1937. The jackhammer drove down. 90 years of New Deal concrete cracked open like dry bread at 6:15 on a Tennessee Sunday morning. I stood 30 yards back in my work boots, coffee in one hand, phone recording in the other. Bryn turned, smoothed her cashmere wrap, and gave me a smile polished enough to close a real estate deal. "Mr. Latham," she said, "pay the fees or watch it come down. Your choice." Behind her, the crew kept eating my spillway. Behind me, the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation was already in motion. She didn't know that the dam she had just ordered destroyed was the only thing keeping her 240 homes out of a 100-year floodplain. Drop your state in the comments. I want to know who's watching. My name is Carter Latham. I'm 50 years old, and for 30 of those years, I designed, inspected, and rehabilitated dams for the United States Army Corps of Engineers in a quiet civilian career that took me from Mississippi to Pennsylvania and home again to the foothills of East Tennessee. I retired in November of last year, 3 months earlier than planned. After a stroke I do not feel like discussing in detail. I survived. My language came back. My right hand learned to draw plans again. I came home to the family land in Blount County, Tennessee, 2 ridges south of Maryville, where my grandfather Wallace Latham was born in 1908, where my father was born in 1944, and where I grew up running barefoot down to the lake my grandfather had helped build for the WPA in 1937. That dam is the spine of this story, so let me tell you about it. Wallace Latham was a young man when the New Deal came to East Tennessee. He volunteered with a civilian Conservation Corps engineering crew that was reshaping the watershed in our valley, and he worked alongside a project foreman named Granville Hodge to design a 30-foot earthen dam across Sweetwater Branch on what was then the Latham family's 200 acres. The dam created a 14-acre lake. It controlled flood pulses on the lower Sweetwater drainage, which at the time still carried the scars of the 1929 flood that had wiped out a sawmill, 3 farms, and 4 lives downstream. Wallace asked the Tennessee government, in writing, that the dam be permanently retained as flood control infrastructure for the watershed below. The state agreed. He signed a deed restriction that ran with the land in perpetuity. The paper was filed at Blount County in 1937. I have read that paper enough times to recite it. I remember my grandfather in his last summer before he died in 1989, walking me up the dam crest at dawn with a thermos of black coffee and the blueprints rolled under one arm. He was 81. He pointed to the spillway weir and told me a dam was a promise written in dirt and concrete. He told me a promise like that has to be inspected every year, signed for every year, walked every year, the same way you walk a fence line. He told me one day this dam would be mine. He said, "Carter, when that day comes, do not let anybody who hasn't read the deed tell you what's inside it." My wife, Marin, did not get to grow old with me. She died of a brain aneurysm in 2022, at 45, while making coffee on a Tuesday morning. Our son, Beck, was 12. He's 15 now. He's 6 feet tall, all elbows and quiet humor, and he wants to be a structural engineer like his father and his great-grandfather. He spends most weekends with me on the lake, fishing or kayaking or running terrain models on his laptop while I drink coffee on the dock. The land sits in a small valley with cedar-lined ridges on either side, oak hollows turning gold in October, and the Smoky Mountain skyline visible from my front porch on a clear day. The lake itself is shaped like a green comma, fed by Sweetwater Branch on the north end and overflowing through a 1937 concrete spillway on the south. From the spillway, the water runs about 3/4 of a mile down through a steeper ravine. And then the valley opens up and the watershed carries the flow another 2 miles to the Little River. In 2018, a developer named Sutton Caldwell bought 80 acres of bottomland in that broad section of the lower watershed, hired a fast Knoxville engineering firm to do a flood study, got himself a county zoning approval, and built 240 luxury homes on the floor of the floodplain. He named the development Sadler Ridge Estates. His wife, Bryn Caldwell, became its first HOA board president. The first time she crossed my property line was a Saturday in late March. She rolled up the gravel drive in a white SUV with a magnetic HOA logo on the door, parked at my gate, and stood at the edge of the dam with a manila folder in one hand and a smile that had been practiced for closing pharmaceutical sales calls. That was the day she told me I was going to start paying her HOA a monthly drainage maintenance fee. That was the day she made her first mistake. It would not be her last. Bryn Caldwell stood with her back to the lake and her front toward me, as if she were the host and I were the late guest. Her wrap was cashmere. Her watch was a Patek Philippe she clearly wanted me to notice. Her perfume cut through the wet smell of the spillway in a way I will not forget. "Mr. Latham," she said, "I'm here on behalf of Sadlerage Estates Homeowners Association. As you may know, the creek that feeds your lake passes through our subdivision before it reaches the little river. The board has determined that your impoundment functions as part of our neighborhood drainage system. We're here today to enroll you in our shared maintenance program." I looked at her for a long moment. I looked at her folder. I looked at the spillway behind her, which had been built before her grandfather was born. "Mrs. Caldwell," I said, "the creek leaves my dam and travels 3/4 of a mile through state-protected ravine before it reaches your subdivision. Your subdivision drains into the creek. The creek does not drain into your subdivision. I'm not on your drainage system. Your drainage system is, by definition, on mine." She smiled the way some people smile at a child who has misunderstood directions. "Mr. Latham," she said, "we'd really prefer not to escalate this. The fee is $4,800 per month. We've been very generous in calculating it." "You're trying to charge me $4,800 a month for the privilege of letting your subdivision drain into my creek. For shared maintenance." "There is no shared maintenance. There is no shared anything. You're downstream of me. That's how water works." She looked at the lake. She looked at the dam. She looked back at me. "Mr. Latham," she said, "we have been advised that an unmaintained earthen dam upstream of a residential community presents an unacceptable risk to property values. The board has voted to either incorporate your impoundment into our shared system or recommend its removal." I let that sentence sit between us in the morning sun. "Mrs. Caldwell," I said, "I'm a retired senior engineer with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I personally inspected this dam every year for the last 26 years. I personally drafted, signed, and filed the most recent state inspection report 11 months ago. The state of Tennessee classifies this structure as an intermediate hazard earthen dam in good condition. There is no maintenance deficiency. There is no public risk. There is, however, a recorded deed restriction from 1937 that legally prohibits removal of this dam in perpetuity." She blinked twice. Her smile didn't crack, it just slowed down. "I'd like you to leave my property," I said. She left. She drove out the way she had come in, slowly, taking the time to turn her head and look at the dam one more time as if it had personally insulted her. That afternoon, I called my old field colleague at the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. His name was Hollis Pickering, a senior dam safety engineer in their Knoxville office, who had inspected the Latham Dam alongside me for half my career. I told him about Bryn Caldwell. He was quiet for a long beat. Then he said, "Carter, you know who Sutton Caldwell is, don't you?" "The developer of Sadlerage," I said. "And the brother-in-law of Judge Garland Holcomb at Blount County Circuit. Brace yourself, brother. They are going to come at you sideways." I thanked him. I drove into Maryville that afternoon and bought 8 cellular trail cameras with night vision, 2 reinforced gate locks, and a 400-page leather-bound notebook from a stationery store off Broadway. I drove home, set up the cameras along the dam crest, the spillway, the access road, and the upper feeder creek. I put the notebook on my kitchen table and started a fresh log. Beck came home from school at 4. He saw the notebook. He saw the locks. He set his backpack down at the kitchen door and asked, the way he had inherited from his mother, without raising his voice, "Dad, is this going to be a long thing?" "Probably." "Are they messing with the dam?" "They want to." He went quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Granddad Wallace would have told them to come back when they had a permit and a brain." I told him that was probably the most accurate prediction I had heard all day. That evening, a retired neighbor named Buck Easton drove up the gravel road in his '85 Chevy pickup. He was 83 years old, a former Smoky Mountain Park ranger, and had played dominoes with my grandfather every Friday for 31 years. He climbed out slow, leaned his cane against the bumper, and walked up to my porch with the quiet purpose of a man who had seen every kind of trouble at least once. "Carter," he said, "heard about the white SUV. You okay?" "I'm okay, Buck." He squinted at me. "You remembering what your grandfather used to say about a fight you didn't pick?" "Win it slow," I said. He nodded once. "And bring receipts." He climbed back in his truck and drove off. He didn't say another word about it that evening, but for the rest of the week, his old Chevy parked in my driveway every morning at first light, just so anybody passing the road would see he had taken a side. Within a week, the violation letters started. The first one arrived on heavy linen paper, with the Sadlerage HOA logo embossed in navy and gold. It cited me for 3 counts of drainage system non-compliance, totaling $14,400 in penalties, and demanded payment within 30 days. The second, 10 days later, cited me for vegetative overgrowth on shared infrastructure, which was a creative description of the maple trees on the backside of my dam that had been planted there in 1949 by my grandfather. The third, 2 weeks after that, cited me for uncoordinated water release events, which was a creative description of rain. I responded to each letter in writing. I cited statute. I cited the 1937 deed restriction. I cited my engineer's license. I attached the most recent state dam safety inspection report. I sent each one certified mail. Bryn Caldwell ignored every reply. She also began, quietly, to expand the campaign. A county code enforcement officer named Rita Bramwell showed up 2 weeks later. She was a careful woman in her late 40s, with a clipboard and the polite, exhausted manner of a public servant who has been called out one too many times on neighbor complaints. She was apologetic. She walked the dam with me, examined the spillway, looked at my inspection records, and shook her head. "Mr. Latham," she said, "this is the cleanest privately maintained intermediate hazard dam I have inspected in the 8 years I've held this job. There is nothing here. I am marking the complaint as unfounded. I am also flagging it as potentially harassing." I thanked her. I asked her, off the record, who had filed the complaint. She showed me. Bryn Caldwell, with a co-signature from Sutton Caldwell. The second complaint, 3 weeks after that, came from the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation's Division of Water Resources. The complainant alleged a fish kill in Sweetwater Branch caused by chemicals leaching from my dam. A junior inspector drove out, took water samples at 4 points, took sediment cores, examined my fish populations. The lake came back so clean that he later cited it as a benchmark site for water quality reference samples in his region. He told me, off the record, that the same complainant had filed similar reports against 3 other landowners in the county. That night I sat on the dock with Beck, eating fried catfish and watching a great blue heron stand statue still in the cattails near the inlet. Sweetwater Branch ran clean over the spillway behind us. The sound of falling water against limestone was the closest thing to a meditation tape my grandfather ever owned. Beck asked me if I was scared. I told him no. I told him my granddaddy had built this dam during the Great Depression, with hand tools, government rations, and a foreman named Granville Hodge, who could not read but could measure water with his eye. I told him that whatever Bryn Caldwell thought she was doing it against 90 years of paperwork, 3 generations of Latham engineers, and a State Department that had me on speed dial. He nodded. He chewed his catfish slowly the way Marin used to chew, taking time to taste it. Then he said, "Make her sorry the slow way, Dad." I told him I would. That night, I lay awake in the upstairs bedroom and listened to the dam through the open window. The soft rush of the spillway, the bullfrogs in the cove, the wind moving through the maple leaves my grandfather had planted 76 years before. I thought about every rotation of inspection records I had filed since 1998. I thought about Wallace at 81, walking the crest at dawn with a thermos, telling me a dam is a promise written in dirt and concrete. I thought about the page of paper a Patek Philippe wearing real estate agent thought she could outrun. I went to sleep with the window open. The spillway was still running clean when I woke up at 5. The next morning, a process server came up the driveway in a white sedan and handed me a stack of legal documents an inch thick. The Saddler Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, it turned out, had filed a public nuisance lawsuit in Blount County Circuit Court. It alleged that my dam constituted an attractive nuisance and a potential public hazard. It asked the court to compel me, under penalty, either to enter into a $4,800 a month drainage maintenance contract with the HOA or to demolish the dam at my own expense within 60 days. I read the petition twice on my front porch with the catfish smell still on my hands. Then I called Dale Whitcomb, a small-town country lawyer who had grown up 2 ridges over and had handled my grandfather's, my father's, and my own land issues since I had taken over the deed in 2008. Dale read the petition slowly over the phone. When he was done, he said one word: brazen. He told me to come to his office at 8 a.m. the next morning. He told me to bring every document I owned that related to the dam, plus the original 1937 WPA correspondence, plus a thermos of dark roast coffee from the diner on Broadway. I brought all of it. Dale Whitcomb's office was a single-room practice on the second floor of a 1908 building above a feed store, with one window that looked out over the railroad tracks and one slow ceiling fan that had been turning since the Truman administration. Dale was 64, lean, slow-spoken, and one of the sharpest contract lawyers in East Tennessee. He spread the documents across his conference table the way a poker player spreads a winning hand. He read for 2 hours. He muttered. He drew arrows. He underlined. He wrote, in long Tennessee longhand, "No standing and intermediate hazard," across separate sheets of yellow legal pad. Finally, he leaned back, folded his hands across his stomach, and looked at me. "Carter," he said, "this case is junk. Their drainage easement claim is fiction. Their nuisance theory has no precedent. The court ought to throw it out at first appearance." But Judge Holcomb is presiding, and Judge Holcomb is Sutton Caldwell's wife's first cousin. I know. Then you know we are not going to win at the trial level. We are going to lose at the trial level. He is going to issue an order that gives the HOA exactly what they want, and then we are going to take it to the Court of Appeals, where we will win, eventually, on the law. How long is eventually? 8 to 14 months. I sat in his office and let that timeline settle. Then I asked Dale what we should do in the meantime. He smiled, slowly, the way a country lawyer smiles when he sees a flaw in someone else's logic that they have not noticed yet. "Carter," he said, "the HOA wants you to pay or demolish. Tell the judge, on the record, that you are going to demolish." I stared at him. Demolish. Demolish. Out loud. In court. With a stipulated timeline. And while everybody on the Saddle Ridge side is celebrating, you are going to file every single notification required under the Tennessee Safe Dams Act, Section 46, subsection C, for the demolition of an intermediate hazard dam. You are going to trigger a full state public hearing. You are going to trigger a FEMA flood map review. You are going to trigger an EPA wetlands consult. You are going to bring this entire process out into the open, where the law lives. And when the people of Saddler Ridge Estates find out what is about to happen to their floodplain, they are going to come find Bryn Caldwell themselves. I looked at him for a long moment. I started to laugh quietly. He started to laugh quietly. Outside the window, a freight train moved through Maryville at the slow Tennessee pace it had been moving at for 120 years. The hearing was set for the second Thursday in May. Bryn Caldwell arrived in pearls and a navy suit. Her husband sat behind her. Their attorney, a man named Garland Ridley out of Knoxville, presented the petition with confidence. Judge Holcomb listened with the careful neutrality of a man who already knew how he was going to rule. When Dale stood, he was brief. He said only that, while we disputed the legal premises of the petition, my client was prepared, in the interest of resolution, to elect demolition rather than the proposed maintenance contract, provided that all required state and federal regulatory processes were honored. Judge Holcomb nodded, signed the order, and gave me 60 days. Bryn Caldwell, across the courtroom, smiled the same polished smile she had brought to my driveway in March. Outside the courthouse, on the steps, she walked past me close enough that I could smell her perfume. "Mr. Latham," she said, low and bright, "enjoy your last summer at the lake." I did not answer her. I tipped my hat, the way my grandfather had tipped his. I drove home. I sat on the dock with Beck and watched a heron lift off the cattails into a slow Tennessee dusk. I told him what we had just set in motion. He smiled the way his mother used to smile, when she had figured out a problem before anyone else in the room. "Dad," he said, "they have no idea what they just walked into." I told him no. They had no idea at all. The next morning, I drove down to Hollis Pickering's office in Knoxville, with the court order in a folder on the passenger seat. Hollis was 48, lean, weathered, and had the slow, careful eyes of a man who had spent 20 years deciding which dams in East Tennessee were going to fail next. We had inspected 40 dams together over the years. He had been at Marin's funeral. He read the order without saying a word, set it down on his desk, and pulled 4 maps from a drawer beside him. "Carter," he said, "I need you to look at this." He laid the first map across the desk. It was the FEMA flood insurance rate map for the lower Sweetwater drainage, dated 2017, before Saddleridge Estates had been built. Half the bottomland sat inside the 100-year flood zone, half sat inside the 500-year zone. He laid the second map. It was the FEMA model run in 2018 that had been submitted by Sutton Caldwell's developer team to the county. It showed the bottomland as essentially safe, with only a thin strip along the streambed in any flood zone. The model's footnote, printed in tiny gray text, read, "Assumes existing upstream impoundment remains in service in perpetuity." He laid the third map. It was a current FEMA model run, performed 3 months ago at TDEC's request, with the dam removed. Saddleridge Estates went almost entirely red. 217 of its 240 homes sat inside the 100-year floodplain. 41 of those sat in the floodway itself. The streets became channels in any storm above 2 inches per hour. He laid the fourth map. It was an actuarial analysis run by FEMA's regional office in Atlanta. With the dam removed, the average annual flood insurance premium for a Saddleridge home jumped from $640 to $11,400. Property values, according to the actuarial team's modeling, dropped between 38 and 42%. I sat in his office and read the maps 3 times. "Hollis," I said, "did the developer's 2018 study disclose the dam dependency?" He looked at me, slow and steady. "Carter," he said, "no buyer in Saddleridge Estates was ever told that the safety of their home was contingent on a private earthen dam 2 miles upstream that they did not own." I sat with that for a long minute. The fluorescent light above his desk hummed. Somewhere in the next office, a printer started up. I thought about the young couple 2 streets in who had used their entire wedding savings as a down payment, and the retired school teacher whose late husband had picked the house for the school bus route. I thought about Bryn Caldwell's perfume cutting through the spillway air. I thought about a footnote in 12-point gray. Then I asked him what the Tennessee Safe Dams Act said about demolition of an intermediate hazard dam with a recorded perpetual deed restriction. He smiled, the first smile I had seen on his face that morning. "Carter," he said, "a TDEC public hearing is required. FEMA must be notified. The Environmental Protection Agency must be consulted because the lake is a registered wetlands. The Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency must be consulted because the lake is a documented fish habitat. The Tennessee Valley Authority must be notified because the watershed below feeds into the Little River, which feeds into the Tennessee River system. The County Emergency Management Agency must be notified because removal of an intermediate hazard dam changes evacuation planning, and every single homeowner downstream within the projected flood inundation zone must receive certified notice with public comment opportunity." He folded his hands. "Carter," he said, "the moment you file demolition paperwork, Saddleridge Estates becomes a public hearing." I drove home that afternoon with the 4 maps copied to a thumb drive in my pocket and the original 1937 WPA deed restriction folded inside my grandfather's old field notebook on the passenger seat. I knew, by the time I crossed the county line, exactly what was about to happen. I knew the order, the timing, and the cost. I knew which agencies would arrive first, which residents would call me before Bryn could stop them, and which moment in the public hearing would be the loudest silence Saddler Ridge Estates would ever know. I drove home the slow way. I let the Tennessee dusk go gold across the ridges, and I let myself smile, just once, alone in the cab of my truck, for the first time in 2 months. Over the next 2 weeks, Dale, Hollis, and I built the public hearing the way you build a house frame. Square corner first, every joist measured. The first thing we did was file the formal notice of intent to demolish with TDEC's Division of Water Resources. The notice triggered every cascading regulatory step Hollis had described. Within 72 hours, FEMA's regional office in Atlanta had assigned a senior floodplain manager named Eli Tatum to the case. Within 5 days, the Tennessee Valley Authority had assigned a watershed coordinator. Within 10 days, the Environmental Protection Agency had assigned a wetlands officer out of their Region 4 office. Within 2 weeks, Blount County's emergency management coordinator, a retired firefighter named Glenn Faulkner, had drafted a revised evacuation plan for the lower Sweetwater drainage that included the words mass casualty incident in 3 separate paragraphs. The second thing we did was hire Dr. Audra Lindholm, a senior hydrologist out of the University of Tennessee, to perform an independent watershed model. Her results matched the FEMA numbers within 3%. She filed her report under her own name with TDEC, FEMA, and the county. She also published an executive summary in plain English that any Saddler Ridge homeowner could read in 15 minutes. The third thing we did was the hardest and the most necessary. I asked Dale to draft a public information letter in plain English to every resident of Saddler Ridge Estates, explaining the legal situation, the demolition timeline, the FEMA flood map changes, the projected insurance premium impact, the projected property value impact, and an open invitation to a community information session at the Sweetwater Volunteer Fire Department on a Tuesday evening in early June. We mailed the letter certified on official letterhead from Dale's firm to every home in Saddler Ridge. The Saddler Ridge HOA tried, that same week, to file an emergency injunction with the county to block the mailing on grounds of harassment of residents. Judge Holcomb, who was the only judge in Blount County who would have granted that injunction, was suddenly unavailable, recused for a conflict of interest he had not previously bothered to declare. The injunction was denied by an out-of-circuit judge in less than 30 minutes. The Tuesday evening community session at Sweetwater VFD was scheduled to start at 7. By 6:45, the parking lot was full. By 7, the firefighters had brought out folding chairs. By 7:15, we had moved the entire meeting outside, into the truck bay, because 260 people had shown up. I did not speak first. Hollis Pickering did. He stood in his TDEC uniform and explained, in 15 plain English minutes, exactly what an intermediate hazard dam was, and why my dam had been classified that way. Eli Tatum spoke next, presenting the FEMA flood map projections side by side. Glenn Faulkner spoke third, walking through the revised evacuation plan and the response time estimates if a full pulse storm hit the watershed without the dam. Then Audra Lindholm walked them through the actuarial impact on insurance and property value. Then I spoke. I held up the 1937 WPA deed restriction. I read it aloud, in my grandfather's exact wording, with the audience leaning forward in the warm Tennessee dusk. I told them the dam had been built in 1937, specifically to protect the watershed below. I told them my grandfather had signed a perpetual covenant. I told them I had personally inspected the dam every year for 26 years. I told them the dam was in better condition than most highway bridges. I told them I did not want to demolish it. I told them their HOA was forcing me to. The silence at the back of that fire department truck bay was the loudest silence I have ever heard. A woman in the front row, who I later learned was named Eleanor Gray, raised her hand and asked the question every face in the audience was already wearing. "Mr. Latham," she said, "are you telling us our HOA is suing the only thing keeping our houses dry?" I told her yes. I told her, very plainly, that I was. A man in the third row, who I later learned was a retired Air Force pilot named Carlson Yardley, who had bought his Saddle Ridge home with his entire retirement, stood up, looked at his wife, and walked out of the truck bay without speaking. I knew, watching him leave, that the next 48 hours were going to break the Sadridge HOA in half from the inside. Beck, standing next to me with a clipboard, leaned over and whispered, "Dad, they're done." Outside, the cicadas were running their long, nightly chorus. The smell of barbecue from a Sweetwater VFD potluck still hung in the truck bay. A dozen residents lingered after the meeting was over, hands shoved in pockets, talking quietly to each other in the kind of low voices people use after they've just learned something they did not want to know. One man stayed an extra 45 minutes, walking the FEMA map back and forth, tracing his street with a finger as if the line might move. I told him no. We were not done. We were just getting to the part where Bryn Caldwell figured out what was happening. It took Bryn Caldwell less than 18 hours to figure out what had happened. By Wednesday morning, the HOA's Facebook group was in a knife fight with itself. The post Bryn put up trying to spin the public hearing as Carter Latham's bullying tactics was buried in 214 comments, of which the kindest was the one from Eleanor Gray that simply read, "We were lied to." By Wednesday afternoon, 6 Sadleridge residents had quietly emailed Dale Whitcomb's office, asking how to file individual claims against the developer for failure to disclose floodplain risk. By Thursday, that number was 31. By Friday, the local Maryville-Alcoa Daily Times ran its first article. The reporter was Tabitha Marlowe, a 30-something with a master's degree in environmental science, and the kind of byline that the Tennessee State House already knew. She had been at the Tuesday public session. Her article, run above the fold under the headline, "The Dam Sadleridge Forgot It Needed," included photographs of the FEMA map overlay, a sidebar interview with Audra Lindholm, and a one-line quote from me. "I would prefer not to demolish my grandfather's dam." The Knoxville News-Sentinel picked it up the next morning. The Tennessee Lookout had it by Sunday. By Monday, Nashville's WSMV had a producer calling Hollis Pickering's office. Bryn responded the way Bryn responded to everything. She doubled down. She filed a public statement with the Sadridge HOA, insisting that the demolition was a necessary infrastructure correction. She gave an on-camera interview to a local cable station, in which she described me as an unstable retiree, weaponizing his property against the community. She tried to organize a residents' rally outside my gate. 11 people showed up. 2 of them, Eleanor Gray and a retired school teacher named Marlena Whitaker, showed up holding signs that read, "Save the Dam." The other 9 left within 20 minutes. By the second week of June, the Sadridge HOA's own treasurer, a man named Curtis Hamlin, sent me an unsolicited email attaching a copy of the HOA's emergency board minutes from the previous Friday. Bryn had moved $54,000 out of the HOA's reserve fund into a new line item labeled Community Drainage Litigation. That money had been earmarked, before the move, for a children's playground. I forwarded the email to Dale Whitcomb. I forwarded it to Tabitha Marlowe. I forwarded it to a friend of mine at the Tennessee Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. That same afternoon, the 4 anonymous letters arrived in my mailbox. Each one was handwritten, careful, apologetic. One was from a young couple 2 streets in. They wrote that they had just used their entire wedding savings as a down payment, that nobody had ever told them the FEMA zone designation was contingent on an upstream dam, and that they did not know how they were going to face their parents on Sunday. One was from a retired school teacher who had moved into Sadleridge with her late husband in 2019. She wrote that she had cried twice that week, once in her kitchen and once in her car. The third was from Carlson Yardley, the retired Air Force pilot, who wrote in pencil in clean block letters, "I have voted for the wrong board for 2 years. That ends now." The fourth letter contained a photograph. It was a hand-drawn map of the lower Sweetwater drainage from 1953, made by a survey crew working under TVA contract, and clearly showing the Latham Dam, labeled Wallace Latham Earthen Impoundment, Flood Control, protected for perpetuity. The sender had written, on the back, 3 words in blue pen, "We are sorry." I sat on the porch a long time with that photograph. That night, after Beck had gone to bed, Dale called me with a single sentence. "Carter," he said, "you need to add a security camera on the spillway tonight. I'm hearing things from a friend in Knoxville. They are about to do something stupid." I did exactly what he said. 3 nights later, my phone buzzed at 1:34 a.m. It was a motion alert from the trail camera mounted in the cedar tree 40 feet above the spillway gate. I sat up in bed. The Tennessee dark was full summer thick, all crickets and far-off owl. I opened the camera app. 4 figures in dark hoodies stood at the spillway control house. One was working a hammer drill on the access door. Another was holding a flashlight. 2 more were carrying what looked like 5-gallon buckets of paint or something denser. The third figure standing watch wore a Patek Philippe on her left wrist that caught the flashlight beam and threw a small, bright reflection into the camera lens. Bryn. I rolled the secondary camera. The 2 bucket carriers were walking toward the spillway weir with intent. They were going to dump whatever was in those buckets into the discharge channel. Something black. Something heavy. Something that would, the next morning, look exactly like a chemical spill or sediment plume. Something that would, in a TDEC inspection report, suggest the dam owner was negligent. I called Sheriff Royce Tankersley first. He was 61, square, had grown up 2 ridges over, and had served with my father on the volunteer fire department in the 1970s. He picked up on the second ring. Carter. Royce. I have 4 unidentified persons currently on my dam crest, attempting to tamper with the spillway access door and dump unknown material into the discharge channel. 1:34 a.m. I have all 4 on multiple cameras. One is Bryn Caldwell. "Stay inside," he said. "I'll have 2 units there in 9 minutes." I stayed inside. I called Hollis Pickering. He picked up on the first ring, which surprised me, until I remembered he had told me to call him at any hour during the demolition window. "Hollis, get a TDEC inspector and a water quality crew to my property at first light. Sheriff is on his way for the arrest. They are about to dump something into my spillway." "On it." I watched the cameras. The 4 figures at the door got it open. They photographed the interior. One of them tried to disable the secondary breaker for the dam's siren alert system. They did not, however, know about the redundant battery system Beck had installed 2 weekends before, with my supervision, as a school project. The cameras kept recording. 9 minutes later, 4 cruisers came down the gravel road, lights off until the last 50 yards. They pulled wide on the dam crest from 2 directions, lights on at the same instant. The footage on my phone showed 4 figures, freezing in 8 flashlight beams. Hands going up, drill falling, buckets dropping. Bryn's voice, suddenly small and very high, asking if she could please call her husband. By 3 a.m., she was in handcuffs. The 3 men with her, 2 contractors she had paid in cash, and the HOA's own former vice president, a man named Slade Bickerton, were in handcuffs beside her. The buckets, when forensics opened them, contained a mixture of waste oil, drywall sediment, and dye. The dye was Tennessee orange, not even subtle. Royce came up to the porch where I was waiting with coffee. He took the mug. He looked at me. "Carter," he said, "she's been caught at 1:34 in the morning, on your registered intermediate hazard dam, attempting to dump environmental contaminants into a state-monitored watershed, while criminal proceedings are already pending. Do you know how many felonies that just stacked?" I said I had a guess. He said, "You have no idea." The next morning, the Maryville-Alcoa Daily Times ran Tabitha Marlowe's 3rd article, front page, above the fold. The headline read, "Oh, a president arrested at 1:34 a.m., dumping waste oil into dam she sued to remove." By noon, the Knoxville News-Sentinel had reposted it. By 3 p.m., the Nashville stations had it. By 5 p.m., it had been picked up by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. By Saturday morning, the AP had moved a national wire story. Sutton Caldwell filed for divorce on Sunday morning. He had his attorneys hand-deliver the papers to the Blount County Jail before lunch. The TDEC public hearing was 4 days away. The TDEC public hearing was held in the auditorium of the Sweetwater Volunteer Fire Department, the same room where, 4 weeks earlier, 260 Sadler Ridge residents had first learned the truth about their floodplain. The room was packed past the legal occupancy limit by 6 p.m. Sweetwater VFD opened the truck bay again and ran extension cords for additional folding chairs. The hearing officer, a calm administrative judge, named Director Sterling Hawthorne from TDEC's Nashville office, called the room to order at 7 sharp. The HOA's attorney, Garland Ridley, sat at one table. His client was, of course, absent. Bryn Caldwell was at her arraignment in a different building 3 blocks away. Sutton Caldwell sat in the 3rd row, alone, with his hands folded in his lap. Dale Whitcomb sat at our table, with a single leather folder and a yellow legal pad. Beside us sat Hollis Pickering in his TDEC uniform. Beside him, Eli Tatum from FEMA. Beside Eli, Glenn Faulkner from Blount County Emergency Management. Beside Glenn, Dr. Audra Lindholm. Behind us, Tabitha Marlowe with 2 photographers. Beside her, the Knoxville News Sentinel, the Tennessee Lookout, and a senior reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Behind them, 240 Sadler's residents. Director Hawthorne read the case caption. He read the procedural history. He invited Garland Ridley to speak first. Mr. Ridley stood. He spoke for 11 minutes. He talked about community necessity and unmaintained infrastructure and quality of life. He never once produced an engineering report. He never once mentioned the FEMA flood maps. When he sat down, the silence in the truck bay was so deep you could hear the cicadas in the cedars outside. Director Hawthorne turned to Dale. Dale stood. He cleared his throat once. He laid the leather folder open on the table. Director Hawthorne, he said, with the court's permission, my client and the supporting agencies will present 6 exhibits. He held up the first sheet. This is the 1937 deed restriction, signed by Wallace Latham, recorded with Blount County, granting the state of Tennessee a perpetual covenant that the Latham earthen impoundment shall be maintained as flood control infrastructure for the lower Sweetwater drainage. It runs with the land. It cannot be revoked. He held up the second. This is the FEMA flood insurance rate map for the lower Sweetwater drainage with the dam in service. This is the same map with the dam removed. With removal, 217 homes in Sadler Ridge Estates enter the 100-year floodplain. 41 enter the floodway itself. He held up the third. This is the developer's 2018 Environmental Impact Assessment, submitted by Sutton Caldwell to Blount County, which assumed the dam would remain in service in perpetuity. The assumption was buried in a footnote in 12-point gray. No buyer ever saw it. He held up the fourth. This is the Tennessee Safe Dams Act registration record. The Latham Dam is classified intermediate hazard. Demolition without state approval is a Class A misdemeanor. Demolition without honoring the recorded perpetual covenant exposes the petitioner and the developer to Tennessee floodplain liability statutes, worth, by Dr. Lindholm's modeling, approximately $140 million. He held up the fifth. This is footage, recorded at 1:34 a.m. on June 21st, of Mrs. Bryn Caldwell and 3 accomplices on my client's registered dam, attempting to dump waste oil and drywall sediment into the spillway discharge channel. Mrs. Caldwell is currently under indictment on 6 felony counts. He held up the 6th and final sheet. And this, Director Hawthorne, is a notarized perpetual conservation easement, signed today by my client, dedicating the Latham Earthen Dam and the 14-acre lake behind it to the Tennessee Valley Authority as protected flood control infrastructure, in perpetuity, with maintenance covenants funded by the Wallace Latham Watershed Trust. He laid all 6 sheets on the table. Behind us in the gallery, Sadler's residents stood, slowly, 1 row at a time. Eleanor Gray stood. Carlson Yardley stood. Marlena Whitaker stood. Curtis Hamlin stood. By the end of 1 slow minute, every Saddle Ridge resident in the room was on their feet, silent, facing Sutton Caldwell at his isolated chair in the 3rd row. He did not look back. Director Hawthorne looked at Garland Ridley. He looked at Sutton Caldwell. He looked at me. Mr. Latham, he said, on behalf of the state of Tennessee, I deny the petitioner's request for demolition. I accept the perpetual conservation easement. I am ordering the immediate transfer of regulatory oversight of this dam to the Tennessee Valley Authority, and I am referring the petitioner's filings to the Tennessee Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division for investigation. He brought the gavel down once, hard. I felt Beck's hand grip my shoulder. The civil settlement and criminal sentencing came 8 months later. The Sadler Ridge Estates Homeowners Association was reorganized by court order under a new board, with Eleanor Gray elected the first new president and Curtis Hamlin elected vice president. Bryn Caldwell pleaded guilty to felony tampering with critical infrastructure, felony illegal dumping in a state-protected watershed, felony filing of a fraudulent civil complaint, and felony conspiracy. She served 21 months in state custody, paid a six-figure restitution order, and was permanently barred from sitting on any homeowner's board in the state of Tennessee. Her husband, Sutton Caldwell, settled a class action disclosure lawsuit brought by 91 Saddle Ridge homeowners for $37 million. He surrendered his contractor's license. He moved out of the county. The total damages awarded to me in the consolidated civil action came to $4.8 million. I did not keep most of it. I worked with Dale, Hollis, Audra, Glenn Faulkner, and the new Sadridge board to put $4 million of those dollars into a thing we called the Wallace-Latham Watershed Trust. The trust paid for a permanent endowment for annual dam maintenance, performed at no cost to me, with full TDEC oversight. It paid for a county-wide flood preparedness program in Blount County, including emergency siren upgrades for every neighborhood within a registered flood inundation zone. It paid for an annual scholarship in my grandfather's name, the Wallace-Latham Watershed Engineering Award, given each year to a Tennessee student pursuing civil or environmental engineering. The first recipient, announced on the trust's first anniversary, was a young woman from Sevier County whose family had lost their farm in the 2010 floods. I drove out with Beck to deliver the check in person. The Sadler Ridge Estates community held its first annual Dam Stewardship Festival the second Saturday of October that year. 240 households turned out. They walked the dam crest. They toured the spillway. They listened to Hollis Pickering explain, in plain English, how an earthen dam works, how an intermediate hazard classification is determined, and how a community comes to depend on a structure that nobody bothers to look at until somebody tries to take it away. Beck, 15 and growing into his frame, stood next to me at the spillway and explained the redundant battery system he had built, while his classmates from Maryville High School took notes. Eleanor Gray hung a small bronze plaque at the dam crest that afternoon. The plaque read, Wallace-Latham, Earthen Dam, built 1937 by the Works Progress Administration and the Latham family, protected in perpetuity by the communities it serves. I have learned a few things from all of this. I'd like to share them, if you'll let me. The first is that paperwork outlives bullies. My grandfather signed a deed restriction in 1937 that, 88 years later, ended a multi-million-dollar lawsuit before it could finish a single appeal. If you have inherited land, sit with the documents. Read the clauses nobody told you mattered. The clauses nobody told you mattered are always the clauses that matter. The second is that water finds its level, and so does community. An HOA is not a fortress. An HOA is just a list of names. When the names find out the truth, they revote, they reorganize, and they remember who told them the truth in time. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA with a clipboard and a logo, drop your story below. Tell me your county. Tell me your state. Tell me the moment you finally said no. I read every one. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's a story coming up about a widowed beekeeper in upstate New York whose HOA tried to outlaw her hives and forgot to check what was officially listed as a state-protected pollinator sanctuary. You don't want to miss what she had on file in Albany. But that's a story for next time. Tonight, I'm going to walk the dam crest at dusk. I'm going to listen to the spillway in the dark. And I'm going to thank my grandfather, Wallace Latham, one more time for signing his name to the page in 1937. It mattered. It always mattered.
There's something I want you to take from this story before you click away. Bryn Caldwell didn't fall because Tennessee law was harsh. She fell because she was confident in things she had never ever bothered to check. She never read the deed restriction. She never asked whose dam was holding back the water about to be in her own kitchen. She assumed her HOA's monthly fee schedule outrank a piece of paper Wallace Latham had signed for the WPA in 1937. Carter's real advantage was never anger. It was patience. A leather notebook, 8 trail cameras, his grandfather's covenant, and a 50-year-old son who knew how to wire a redundant battery system. Underneath all of it was the Tennessee truth that a dam holds back what your eyes cannot see, until the day someone tries to take it away. Communities aren't built by the loudest voice at the HOA meeting. They are built by people who read the deed, the damn crest. If a story like this has hit your county, tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Hit subscribe. There's a widow beekeeper in upstate New York you want to meet.